I know you were hoping for more music and not preaching yet, but we will get back to more of that. Just needed to leave a little extra time. I think maybe a 50-minute message today, so no, I'm teasing. We will get back to some more worship time. I wanted to do this a little differently to give some more digest time after the message so that we can kind of process and let God's word sort of sink in and settle in to our heart this morning. So we'll strap in and hear what God has to say to us this morning. If you would, pull out your bulletin for a second. There's a quote on the front cover of the bulletin that I want to read as we start out this morning. We've been in this series in Ephesians called Identity, and we're going to be getting back to that main overarching theme this morning. And there's a quote on there. It says, "In all creation, identity is a challenge only for humans. Identity is never simply a creation. It's always a discovery. True identity is always a gift from God." And it's that first line that I want us to see. In all creation, identity is a challenge only for humans. When you woke up this morning, went outside and saw some of the trees didn't struggle with what they were going to be this morning or who they are. They were a tree yesterday, they are a tree today. They don't struggle with their identity. And I know it's wintertime and all the flowers are dead, but when the flowers come up again from the ground next year, they won't wonder which flower am I going to come up this year. It will be the same flower that they were last year. As the deers run through the woods and do what deer do in the woods, they don't have any problem doing that. And the birds in the air, and they chirp. Nobody has a problem with their identity except for humans. It's a challenge for us. And we know it's a challenge because we, especially in our younger years, we're trying to formulate who we are. Our personalities try to figure it out, and it's kind of like changing clothes sometimes, especially when you're young. You're trying on different personalities, maybe waiting for one to stick, waiting for one that will reveal something about who you are. And sometimes it's more like a caricature, what we find. There's some truth to it, but it's distorted. And we know that journey towards finding out who we are is a difficult one and has a lot of challenges to it. But what about spiritual identity? How do we find out who we are spiritually? And if finding out who we are as humans is difficult, all the more is it difficult when we're trying to discover our spiritual identity. And here in the text, as we're going to go into Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 32, Paul's going to deal with the identity, our spiritual identity. And as we walk through this text this morning, that's going to come to light. And he's going to give us a baseline for understanding who we are. Because you know, when we find out who we are, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier. Identity is a challenge only for humans. So let's see what Paul has to say, starting in verse 17. "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They're darkened in their understanding. They're separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life that you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in Him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off the old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption." Verse 31, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ and God forgave you. Well, there are a lot of verses here this morning, and there are a lot of instructions that are here in this text. And it would be easy for us to go and run towards the instructions and all the things Paul wants us to do. But it's important that we follow Paul's line of argument. One of the ways in which I've learned to grow in studying the Bible and getting something out of it is I've asked myself, what is the main thing? What's the main argument? What's the main point? Because a lot of times we can pick the details and we can make the details the main part of the message, and those are designed to color what the main point is. And so in this text, it's very important that we get the main argument because it's critical. It's mission critical for what Paul has to say here about identity. Because Paul, before he gives any instructions, is going to talk about the old nature and the new nature. And it's important that we see those things. We see what he wants to say. His first instruction to them is, I tell you this, and he insists on it, he says, that you must live no longer as the Gentiles. Well, Paul was writing to Gentiles, wasn't he? Live no longer like the Gentiles. In other words, Paul's saying, I don't want you to live like the world around you. So that's his instruction. I don't want you to live like the world around you. And in verse 20, he tells why. Because that's not what you were taught. You were taught with regard to the former way of life to put off the old self and to put on the new self. So this whole text is about putting off the old self, putting on the new self, gaining a sense of our identity, our spiritual identity. So let's look in the first couple of verses, in 17, 18, and 19, at the identity of the old nature, because Paul wants us to see this part of who we are. As we go through these different descriptions, it's easy for us to point and say, this is those people. Because, we're in the church. We're Christians. So Paul's talking about those people out there. But Paul's giving this instruction to the believers. And so why is Paul wanting the believers to understand the depth of this old nature? So as we go through this, realize that when the old nature is creeping up in you, this is what's playing out here in the text. This is what's going on. And there are some powerful descriptors that will help us understand the identity of our old nature. So here we go, the identity of the old nature. The first thing that Paul says is that he doesn't want them to live like the Gentiles in the futility of their thinking. What is futile thinking? Futile thinking is purposeless. It's pointless. It has no end. And so when you're living like the world and the old nature creeps up, you're living for yourself. You're living for yourself. There's no other point. And that old nature is like that. It does what it wants to do. And it's going nowhere. It's pointless. It's useless. And so their thinking is futile. It says their understanding is darkened. Their understanding is darkened. That idea of being darkened, to be made less clear, and progressively so. Their understanding is progressively unclear. To be darkened, and now that it's getting darker earlier, and we're all well aware of that, and I always think at 6 o'clock it's like 9 or 10 o'clock, but when it's getting dark, you can still see what's out there, right? You can still see the trees, you can still see your car in your driveway, but as the darkness falls, you progressively see less and less. And when the old nature is coming out and stirring up within you, that's what's happening to our understanding. We're seeing less and less of the truth, till the point where we can't see anything. And if you live out in the country where there are no lights, you could put your hand in front of your face and not even see it. And that's the progression of the old nature that Paul wants them to understand about the old nature. Paul says that they're separated from the life of God. There's a divide between them, separated from the life of God, God's life-giving spirit not pouring out into them. They're kept apart. There's an intervening barrier between them. And when the old nature is rising up within us, there's a barrier between us and God. And we're separated from the inflow of his life into us. He also uses the word ignorance. that they're ignorant. And why are they ignorant? Is it because they're stupid? No, this isn't about intellect here. This is about acknowledging God. And when the old nature creeps up, who are we more acknowledging? Ourself. And we're not acknowledging God. And so he says they're ignorant. They don't know. They're not acknowledging God and that they're accountable to him, that we have to stand before him. And in that process, it says their heart is hardened. There's the hardening of their heart. It's that ongoing way that our old nature hardens us. It's an ongoing action. It's the process of becoming more solidified, rigid, and hard and stiff. And it's really the hardening of our heart toward whom? Toward God. We become hardened toward God. And those are all descriptions of our old nature and what wells up within us. And so when we're letting that nature control us, this is what's going on. Our thinking is futile. Our understanding is dimming. We're separated in a greater way from the life of God. We're not acknowledging him, and our heart is getting calloused and hard. And what's the impact of that? What is the impact of that? Verse 19 gives us the impact. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. The impact of the old nature is that they have lost all sensitivity. Why is that? Well, when your heart's hard, what can you feel? You can't feel anything. If your heart has been hardened, nothing can penetrate, nothing can impact. And so they've lost all sensitivity. They've been dulled. Their sharpness has been taken away. The word desensitized is a good word to use for having lost all sensitivity. They've been desensitized. They can't feel what they're really doing anymore. It doesn't hit in the same way. They're not aware of the impact of their actions. Isn't that true for us? When that nature is dominating our life, we lose sensitivity. We're dulled. We're desensitized. We can't feel the real impact that it's having on us, and we certainly don't feel the impact that it's having on the people around us. What a description, having lost all sensitivity. But it goes on from there. Having lost all sensitivity, it's progressive. Now they're giving themselves over to sensuality. Why? Why are they giving, if they've lost all sensitivity, they can't penetrate the heart. The heart can't be impacted. It's callous now. Why are they giving themselves over to sensuality? Well, when your heart is hard, the only thing left for you to be able to feel is your physical senses. So sensuality, they would want the best of all the foods, best of all the physical pleasures that there are. What you hear and see, all of the senses, that's the only thing that can penetrate, the only thing that can make you feel alive. And so if your heart is hardened, it shouldn't shock us that we run after sensual things. It's the only thing that interjects and intervenes and gives us a little pop to make us feel alive. Because if our heart is hardened, we're feeling dead. Well, humans do not like to feel dead. And so we'll do what we have to do to feel a little pop, to get a little life. And so all we're left with is sensuality. And there is a chemical in the brain, and I'm no psychiatrist or psychologist to know too much, other than dopamine gets dumped into your brain when you have all these pleasure-seeking things. And if you want to know what the technical definition of that is, it's the happy feelings. It's the happy feelings. When you do certain sensual things, it dumps happy feelings into your body. Well, if you can't feel anything, all you can go after is the happy feelings. That's the impact when the old nature comes up within us. But Paul describes it in an even further way. They've lost their sensitivity, so they've given themselves over to sensuality to indulge in every kind of impurity. So now it's turning specifically towards the physical, towards the sexual. Indulge in every kind of impurity. This is the idea of to indulge is a transaction. It's a business transaction. There's a trade that's going on. We're trading our soul. We're trading who we are for these sexual pleasures, and we're indulging in them. And when we go there, we're making an exchange. And that description ends with the description of being full of greed. Full of greed. Greed is wanting more than your share. Wanting more than what's due you. So it's exploiting others to get more than your share. And in particular, in this context, because it's attached to the sensuality, it's specifically hammering on that side of it. It's when you take something that isn't yours sexually. And if there's a willing participant on the other end, you're still taking something that doesn't belong to you as a spouse when you pursue that course. You're taking something that isn't yours. And worse yet, if you're taking something and they're not willing. That's the kind of greed Paul is talking about. This is the identity of the old nature that he wants us to be aware of. Why does Paul go to such great lengths to talk about this old nature in such great detail? He wants us to know who we are and what lives within us. You see, that old nature is still walking around with you. It's still walking around with you. And if we can't honestly take a look at our identity, we're going to be messed up, aren't we? Just like when you're trying to figure out who you are and your personality, it's a difficult journey, and it's hard when you don't know who you are. Paul wants them to know who they are. And he gives all of these descriptions, and he gives them to the believers because he wants them and us to know that when the old nature is dominating us, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. He does this before any of the instructions for living a holy life. And we'll see exactly why in a little bit. But it's core that we understand that this identity lives within each one of us. And I want to make it a little bit more personal, and I want to make it burn a little bit more. Sitting next to you, behind you, in front of you, and across the worship center, if the people in this room unleashed their version of their sin nature, we would have accomplished every single sin that's written in the Scriptures. There's enough of us here for that to take place. We don't want to think that about the person sitting next to us. We don't want that reality to exist. We would much prefer there to be a much greater distance between us and that. We prefer, we're Christians, we're better than that. But there is an old nature that this very day is alive and well that walks around with you. And when God invites us to understand the identity of that nature, he's inviting us to be able to deal with it. Because if we don't, that's when we get into trouble. He's giving us an invitation to see and deal with straight on all the ugly that you can feel within you, all the ugly that's there, and to see him do something with it. That's the old nature. That's a part of our identity. But Paul goes on in the next set of verses. He gives a lot more description of that nature than he does of the new nature. But he gives us the crux, the key to understanding the new nature. In verse 20, Paul says, "That, however, is not the way of life that you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him, in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness." There it is, verse 24. What is the new nature? What is the identity of the new nature? It says to put on the new self, and what is that new self? Created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Your nature, the new nature that lives within you, is created to be like God. Wait a minute, I thought I was a sinner. I thought I was bad. I thought nothing good could live in me. Well, nothing good can live in you, in your old nature. But when Christ died on the cross and you put your trust in him and you were born again, you were born and given a new identity. A new identity was handed to you when that took place. And what is that new identity? He says, created to be like God. That language is throwback language. It's a throwback to Genesis, when we were created to be like God. And when we were created perfect in his image. There was no sin, nothing marred what he had created until the fall. And after the fall, that old nature became corrupt, didn't it? There's nothing you can do to change that old nature. It is forever corrupt. And so, what did God do? He gave us a new nature. He gave us a new nature. Isn't that the promise in Ezekiel 36:26? I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. You see, you can work all you want to try to change the old one, and it isn't going to happen. The old one is corrupt. The old one is forever corrupt. And so God had to give you a new one. And guess what? Guess what the reality of the new one is? Look at it. Look at the verse. Created to be like God. This is your new nature that lives within you. In true righteousness and holiness. There is a nature that lives inside of you now that can never be corrupted. Do you know that? If the new nature that God gave you could be corrupted, he'd have to go to the cross again. He went to the cross for the old nature to pay for that. But the new nature he has put infused inside of you. That new heart, that new spirit that he's put inside of you. Uncorruptible. Well, wait a minute. What about all the yucky things I've done since I've been a believer? Doesn't that corrupt? No. It doesn't corrupt that nature. It doesn't corrupt it. I mean, in my mind, I think, wow. But what do you do with the reality that I have this old nature that's never going to get any better? And in fact, it's getting worse. It's getting worse. Your old self is still there. Your old self is corrupt. And in verse 22, it says it's being corrupted. That means it's still happening. So a lot of times we wonder, gosh, I've been a believer for a long time. Why do I still want these awful things? Because it's still being corrupted. That nature can never change. It never will change. And all the effort and energy you put into trying to change that old nature, it's never going to happen. All you can choose to do is to live out of the new nature. And there's a war and a clash that goes on between those two natures. And that's where we get the title of the message for today, a case of spiritual split identities. Split personality. We're familiar with that term when I'm talking about personality. Well, here we have two identities. Two natures living inside of us. That's why so often the Christian life is so difficult. Because we have two things going on within us. You know, character development to me is a bit of a misnomer because it implies that I can get better. I can't get better. All I can do is get better at choosing to live out of the new nature. If I open the lid on the old nature, I know what's coming out. And each one of us has a special brand of sin nature that will come out. But if I open the lid on the new nature, what's going to come out? True righteousness and holiness. That's the only thing that can come out of the new nature. So the job of the Christian is to take the lid off of the new nature and put the lid on the old nature. And maturity in the Christian life is when we take the lid off of the new nature and put the lid on more consistently. That's what maturity in the Christian life is. I'm not going to get any better. And some of my sinful urges and desires and all of that of the flesh isn't going to get any better. You know, this is so tricky in the Christian life. I almost mistitled this message in a huge way. I almost titled this message, Old Self Made New. That was on my notes for several days. And I looked at it and I'm like, that is so wrong. Old self isn't being made new. New self is being made new, you know. But the old self isn't going to get any better. Paul wrestled with this, didn't he? Horribly. He wrestled with it, and he had perfect words to speak of it in Romans 7, verse 15. He says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do it. But what I hate, I do. Sound familiar? And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin, old nature, living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. He sounds like he's going to go crazy. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. Is Paul shirking his responsibilities for owning his own life? No, he is not. He's attaching his actions to the proper identity. He's attaching his actions to the proper identity. I have a graph up here that I want you to take a look at. For anybody who's technical in the room, this is not designed to be technical. It just has a main point, and I'm sure it'll break down if we go too technical on it. But the blue line is the old self. The orange line is the new self. How do I understand? Because a lot of times we think in the Christian life that if I'm in sin, I can't hear from God and I can't grow, right? Like we would all say, oh, if you're living in sin, you can't grow. Well, how do we understand that? Because I've seen people who are growing in their inner man, and yet there are some ugly things still coming out of them. How do we understand that? And I think if we look in the first, the first line there, the old nature, we're so used to living out of the old nature. And the new nature, it's new, and we're trying to learn to live out of it. And so we're bouncing back and forth between those lines until we get to some tipping point where we have practiced living out of the new nature and we become a bit more consistent. However, both lines still exist within us. Both lines are still there. The blue line does not get erased until heaven. And so, how do we understand it when people who are really good people, faithful, man, they hear from the Lord, jump lines and do something out of the old nature? Well, that must have been a whole farce. And I was in a church when I was in college, and the pastor got into some moral trouble. He was a much-loved man, very faithful to the Lord, heard from the Lord, led well, and ended up back on the blue line. The fact that he repented, now, of course, it devastated the church, and everybody was wondering the key question, was everything a farce? Was this a big joke? For some, that is true. The whole thing was a sham. For him, he jumped back on the blue line. So I didn't have to ruin and erase all the ministry that he had done in my life or the others. It still hurt. Don't make any mistake about that. You jump on the blue line, it hurts, and it has a deep impact. But how do we understand that? Is he a horrible person? He took the lid off the old nature instead of the new one. And in the church, the reason that happens so often, not just to church leaders, but to all of us, the reason that happens is because we in the church don't want a blue line. We're okay with it theologically. We are not okay with the details of the blue line. So let me ask you this. What's on your blue line? Because it doesn't matter just that we have a sin nature. What does yours look like? If the cap came off of your old nature, what would it look like? Would you be cheating, stealing, lying? Not Not what kind of impurity would you be in? It's not that you, like, oh, maybe that's not your thing. What kind? That's your blue line. And somebody needs to know the details of your blue line. If somebody in this world who's living doesn't know the details of your blue line, that's when we get to the farther side of that graph and we're more consistent. But because we're not allowed to talk about the blue line anymore, we're not allowed to talk about the details of the blue line anymore, because if I talk about the details of the blue line and you know that those issues are there or those struggles are there, you wouldn't want me to lead your small group. You wouldn't want me to lead your children. You wouldn't want me. And so we're not allowed to deal with it. And then we set people up because the pastor couldn't talk about it. Or any of us, for that matter. That's a real problem. We've got to get to the place where we can deal with the blue line and be honest about the blue line and what's on our blue line. And somebody in this world, or several somebodies, need to know what's on your blue line. And if they don't, do something with it. Hillside needs to be a place where we can talk about the blue line and the details of it. It's important that we do. But we don't like that. I remember when I was sharing with Pastor Carrick. He was a mentor of mine when I first came to Christ in college, and sat down with him, and I was, for the first time, puking up my life and all of my blue line. And he heard me. He was a special man. And he said, he looked at me after I had done all that. He said, Jeff, do you know, he just looked in at me, do you know why I don't do crazy things? Why I don't live in impurity or whatever else? And I'm like, that's why I'm here. Tell me. And he said, because the Spirit lives in me and controls me. Now, I'll be honest, I did not like that answer. I wanted something that I could do. I wanted something I want a bigger wall than that. Like, that's it? That's it? That's your answer for how I'm not going to keep doing this stuff? That's what keeps you? Like, I want a wider wall. I want to believe I'm better than this, that this can't happen. We all do. And that's why we can't talk about the blue line in church, because we want a bigger wall there. What bigger wall could we have other than the Spirit living inside of you to empower you? Does someone know your dark side? Let someone know that. Paul goes on in the next set of verses, and I don't have time to go through all of these instructions, but Paul hammers the old nature, the new nature, and then gives instructions because he wants to make sure that we don't try out of the old nature to follow the rules, and we would be so tempted. We would be so tempted. If we let the old nature try to follow the rules and we actually get decent at it, we will be prideful, holier than thou, self-righteous, and judgmental. So Paul was going to have none of it. He's not going to give the instructions that we would jump to, the do's and the don'ts. There's a danger if we let our old nature try to follow the rules, both if we're successful or feel successful and if we're not. Our actions don't form our identity. They express our nature. As the worship team comes back up, this is what I want you to be able to think on, ponder on for the remainder of this morning. I know after the sermon it's ingrained that it's time to go, but it's not time to go. It's time to process. It's time to let it settle in. It's time to consider, who knows my dark side? Who knows my blue line? Who am I going to talk to about that? How do I take the lid off the new nature? Let's ponder those things. Father, we come to you now, recognizing that we have a spiritual split identity. We need to come to grips with it. with both of those natures. And if we don't take an honest look at both of them, the old one will come out and the new one will be hindered from coming out. Let us now, we've heard from your word, we want you to work it in, massage it into our heart, do something deep within us as we sing, as we seek your face, as we come to you. Would you stand as we worship the Lord?